In class last time, we were looking at still life paintings, begun to look at them, and we were looking at these wonderful depictions of physical objects. And we were talking about different ways to interpret these works, whether or we could talk on the one hand about an artist like Clara Peters, uh, comparing her craft of painting to other creation based crafts like cheese making or baking. Or glass making for that matter, and whether or not she as a painter is every bit as good as they are, that she can turn paint into cheese in the same way that a cheesemaker might turn milk into cheese. But then Peter Klaas's Vanitas still life complicates this issue because indeed it shows us a reminder of death and brings up the possibility that uh, these reflections on temporal life, on life that's bound by time, and the effects of time, and a sort of moralizing overtone might actually be present in more of these still lifes than immediately meet the eye. So with Peter Klaas, we have the skull resting on top of books, and we can think of the paper and the quill pen as being symbols of things that pass away. The quill pen wears out, the pages on the paper are ragged on the edges, like the skull itself and the bone. These remain symbols of time passing. Uh, the upended glass on the left, a symbol of the precariousness of life. The timepiece in the foreground, elaborately constructed. Also, the idea of time passing, and of course the oil lamp that's been snuffed in the background. With Klaas, we might also talk about the fact that the watchmaker's craft is being compared to the painter's craft, or perhaps even the artistry, if you will, of authorship, of writing, also compared to the artist's craft. There's lots of ways and nuances of ways to interpret these still lifes, but I do really believe that with every single one of them, while they are incredibly pleasing to the eye and arguably pleasing to all of the senses, that these still lives are in fact intended also as moral instruction, that they function really in both terms, that there is in fact for all the pleasure that meets the eye, there is more here than meets the eye. Another Peter Klaas on the right from the Moritz House, again a table covered now this time with wonderful things, but you can see a lot of the elements repeat. We have another book on the table, a symbol of the works of man, whether or not those works are intended to be a symbol of how all of our works disappear, or perhaps a symbol of how art can live beyond one's lifetime. These are both distinct possibilities. The cracked nut on the left might actually nuance that meaning, a cracked nut as a symbol of things broken, if you will, uh, and really very much like a skull with something inside of it. Still, when we look at Klaas's work, we see a vast number of very luxurious objects. Excuse me, the taza, which is that silver dish on the right, the beautiful large Roemer, Roemer, that large beer cup, the beautiful knife with its onyx handle, the expensive timepiece on the right. All of these elements add to a sense of worldly possessions. And that's another issue that really we need to talk about with these, is who owned these. Do these objects within the still life reflect things that were owned by the owner of the picture? They seem to repeat in a number of Klaas's images, so they may not be direct objects owned by that viewer, but rather owned by Peter Klaas. Um, at the same time, might they reflect the aspirations of the owner, the sort of things they'd like to own, but they can only own in painting? These are questions I don't think we have a solid answer to, nor does one answer always fit everything. Here's our silver tatsa, and as you can see, it's an extraordinary object. Filigrees hanging from the, or excuse me, beads hanging from the ornate filigree around the base, shiny reflective surfaces painted hyper-realistically, right down to the way in which the light gathers up underneath the base as the silver reflects off of itself. The fall of light is key in these, and we see the light moving in and around and through these objects, suggesting the room in which the piece is set. showing us windows over our shoulders as we look into these reflections, and really almost inviting us to look for more within them. The knife that seems to invite us to join in, to cut some bread, to peel some more lemon, carries Peter Klaas's signature, the intertwined PC of his initials, and then the date engraved as if on the knife blade itself, so that Klaas seems to be asserting that he too is a creator, he too is a craftsman, a master craftsman, making in paint what silversmiths made in metal. These still lifes take on some meaning, I think, when we think of where we've seen similar objects. Where have we seen knives on plates with lemons peeled and falling off of the table? And certainly with Jan Steens as the old Sing, we see these finer objects on the table, the plate coming off the edge of the table, the peel of the lemon. In many ways, being able to peel a lemon like that, where you keep the peel in one piece, is also sort of a sign of virtuosity. And we see it in both of these. If we look at other Jan Steens, this one's in Rotterdam, we find really elements that are extraordinarily close. In this case, the lemon coming off the edge of the table. In this case, the table is a chair, of course. And we see also fine objects in the back, a drink being presented to a man, a silver goblet, a piece of bread, all the same things we see on Klaas's still life. And for Jan Steens' picture on the left, what they mean is they're symbols of how the man in the center, which is a portrait of Jan Steen, how the man in the center is squandering his wealth. Easy come, easy go. There's actually an inscription of that directly above the head of the woman with her hand on her breast that's offering the drink. And the two figures in the background playing backgammon are idling their time away, gambling. And these are all symbols of sort of wasteful behavior. So if we look at that, and then we look at Peter Klaas, and we also see the way in which the dog is sniffing at the lemon, right? It's again letting an expensive item like a lemon, they don't grow in Holland. Letting that go to the dogs is a very obvious metaphor for how the still life in Steens, as a detail in Steens' picture, is a moralizing element. And with Klaas, the question is whether or not that continues. Are these intended to be moralizing? And it does seem as if that's one of many possible readings of the picture. That there's no way around the fact that we can get we can argue that this picture is really very much about partaking in moderation, about the dangers of pleasing our senses, the dangers to our soul of that, and how if one considers one's mortality, signified by the clock, signified by the upended silver cup, signified by the book of writings. One considers one's mortality, one realizes that not all of our choices are neutral. All of our choices, in fact, do come with consequence. And that seems to be a theme that runs through so many of these different still lives. On the left, these artists are all active in Haarlem, by the way. Klaas and Heda are both active in Haarlem. Another still life where we can see some of the same objects. There's another upended taza, another beautiful onyx-handled knife, this time with its handle extended toward us to partake. I believe this is one of the works that one of you guys is going to talk about. I think this is Shelley's work, so I'm not going to say too much about it because we're going to hear a lot about it when we're in the Rijksmuseum when Shelley presents. I don't really want to steal her thunder. But nonetheless, there's a number of sumptuous objects here to view: oysters, lemons, pepper, but also upended elements, glass, taza, and extraordinarily beautiful objects that scholars have found in other works by Heda and have identified. This picture from Venice, for example, a beautiful example of Venetian glasswork. Refined glasswork, and again that idea of an artist rivaling other craftsmen, producing in paint the same sorts of exquisite objects we see other craftsmen producing in other materials. This certainly holds true for the gilded cup in the background, this covered gilt cup with Neptune, the god of the sea, on top of the cup. These are prized possessions, and it goes back to something I had mentioned before. Oh, by the way, here's an example of one. Many of these came out of Germany, and this one here was sold recently at auction. But it's one of the good examples I could find to compare this to. We might find one in the Rijksmuseum while we're there as well to look at. But in any event, the issue here, of course, is what do these objects mean to the viewer? Are they objects that remind them of things that they owned? Since they reappear in pictures, Haida does the same thing Claes does. He reuses objects from picture to picture. But since they reappeared, did they belong to Haida? Were they loaned to him by owners? And what did they mean to the owners of the pictures? Did they remind them of things that they owned? Or did they possibly symbolize for them aspirations, things they might want to own? Again, many of the same elements rearranged. Another silver taza. You can see it's not exactly the same model. This one has more of those globule elements, those semicircular reflective elements on the sides. You can also see how he plays with scale. The rumor now is significantly smaller in scale the taza is significantly smaller than the rumor now. And that suggests to us that while we like to think of these artists as setting up the still life and then painting it, the reality of the situation is that it may well be a product of imagination and little more than that. And the different scales of the thing suggest that the artist really is rearranging different things in his mind and on the canvas rather than on the table. So we have another timepiece, another element that reflects the temporality of our lives. Another beautifully peeled lemon, a symbol of dexterity. Another upended glass, a symbol of precariousness of life, but also maybe being done as well. A nice roll with broken nuts around it. Things we've seen in numerous other pieces. And of course, there's that massive dead fish, cooked fish there as well. Certainly a symbol of life and its passing. Its milky eye, a symbol of death. But still, again, appeal to all of our senses, taste and smell and touch, as well as sight. Everything but hearing, but we might even say that the timepiece even brings the sense of sound into this picture. Again, the question for us remains, do we enter in and partake? Going back to the Boudewijn picture of the Merry Company, their temptations that they are pondering are temptations of the flesh. Some of it is sensual, some of it is erotic, as we see with numbers of the couples that seem to be erotically engaged on one level or another, but this is then paired with the stuff on the table, which itself is appealing to our senses, appealing to our sense of taste. And down in the foreground, we have a little side table with extraordinarily expensive objects, some of which have been laid on the ground. Is this a symbol of carelessness? Is the dog sniffing at it a clue to how we are supposed to look at it as well? The dogs give over to their senses immediately. They don't think twice about it. They'll sniff anything, right? They sniff each other's bums. But are we supposed to do the same? Are we supposed to be as immediately carnally attracted to things based on appealing to our senses? Another still life artist active in Amsterdam was Willem Kalf, and his signature style for still lifes were these ones with a very darkened background. They're meant to be close to the wall, as you can see on the left, where the light of the silver cup reflects through and casts refractions on the wall behind it. But they tend to have the very similar arrangement with a sort of diagonal arrangement, bifurcating the composition similarly in each way. Things arranged very, very close to you, the viewer. We don't see the whole table, but only a portion of it. Things spilling out almost as if into our space. And then the table itself set with extraordinarily beautiful objects. The glassware is not your everyday glassware. These are special glassware. Silver plate, Chinese bowls, silver jugs, imported fruit. That extraordinary glass in the background with its gilded base. And yes, there are examples of these that have survived. all of this is the kind of luxury that we talked about in class, what might be called a pronk still life, Pronk, a still life of luxurious objects. And this is really one of the things that Kolff specialized in. If we look more closely at the porcelain bowl by Kolff, what we find is again another import object, a Chinese bowl. And again, that only attests to its expense, to its value as a luxury object, which we might take for granted in this day of world market, IKEA and whatnot. This is an extraordinarily expensive object, not a local knockoff. Again, we see that lemon peeled so perfectly, again a sign of dexterity. Experts have looked actually at the bowl, and they've found out that the inside of the bowl is decorated in a different style than the outside of the bowl. And the outside is contemporary to the 1650s. That's what bowls looked like that were imported then. But the inside is actually significantly earlier. So again, this ties to this idea that this was a construct on the part of Wilhelm Kolff, that all of the elements here are not just a formal study of stuff hanging out in his studio, but instead intended to be a construction of different themes that together add up to particular meanings. I need to find out more about what the human figure is that's at the base of that cup that we can see here. It might be Hercules. I'll need to take a look a bit further to see. Another Chinese vase appears in this flower still life, and in fact, flower still life is a significant subfield of still life painting. Balthasar van der Ost did a significant number of these flower still lifes, usually with shells included in them as well. And in many ways, these are also a sense of the painter rivaling the craft of other artists, or maybe even the craft of creation itself. These extraordinarily beautiful shells, which were collected by people, put into collections that tried to document all of the wonders of the world. Balthasar van der Ost sort of gives us that by including them here on the table. And he paints within this extraordinary vase with the bird on it. And this is a fascinating comparison, or detail, because what we see is a vase painter's craft, a vase painter who paints a bird. And the bird is realistic enough, but it still exists within the artifice of vase painting, which is very abstract, very sort of duotone, white and blue. And directly in front of it, van der Ost paints a caterpillar, and paints it extraordinarily realistically. So here he's almost as if he's making the proclamation that my work is stronger than theirs. I can paint significantly more realistically than vase painters can. And that demonstration of realism, I think, is part of the reason the shells are there. Part of the whole point of the composition is a demonstration of his realistic ability. The fact that caterpillar has sort of crawled to the edge of the table and then turned back. It's almost like it's going to drop out of the picture, right? Or had the opportunity to, and decided to stay within the painted space. As we look more closely everywhere, we find bugs flying all around. There's a butterfly on the topmost orchid, and then on the left you see soaring in. There's a bee or a wasp, and what's I think is extraordinary is the wasp isn't so close to the wall that it casts a shadow, and it almost gives the illusion that the wasp itself is kind of in our space, that it's going to land on the picture rather than in the picture going to land on the flowers. And this is a theme that van der Ost picks up elsewhere in the picture. So if we look at the white flower, we see this fly on top of it, landing on the flower. But if you look at the way the fly is painted, it's almost as if the fly is sitting on the canvas rather than sitting on the flower. And we've talked quite a bit about legacies of mythologies, about artists. There's a really famous story that van der Ost would have known through different sources that was really widely available in the 17th century, and it goes back to ancient Greece. Apelles was the court painter to Alexander the Great, and was reputed in ancient Greece to be the greatest painter ever. And at one point he gets into a painting contest with Protogenes. And Protogenes paints a picture that is so realistic. He paints a picture of some fruit, some grapes in a bowl. And it's so realistic that flies land on it. Flies are fooled by the reality of his painting, in the same way that maybe Van der Ast is saying this fly is fooled here. And everybody thinks he's won the contest. How can you improve on that? And in fact, what Apelles then does for sort of round two is he paints a picture with a canvas, or excuse me, with a curtain hanging over the top of it, a painted curtain. And Protogenes, when he sees Apelles' painting, wants to find out what he's painting, and he tries to pull back the curtain to reveal the painting underneath. And Apelles then wins, because Protogenes, he can fool dumb animals, insects and whatnot. But Apelles can fool the great artist, and that makes him a better artist still. So there's these wonderful ideas, I think, that Balthasar van der Ast is working with here, and he's not the only one that picks up on this motif of the contest of Apelles by painting insects attracted to the flowers he's painted. They're as real flowers, and they seem to be flying into his picture, landing directly on the surface of his picture, crawling out of his picture as well, in this extraordinary realism that we find in these still life pictures. You'll notice the tulips, extraordinary varieties of tulips with these great colors and changes. Tulips are, of course, a particular pride of the Dutch. I think Jessie said she wanted to go see the tulip fields, and certainly that would be a wonderful thing to do if they're blooming in early March. You probably can see greenhouses if they're not out in the fields. But in the 1600s, there was great investment in different varieties of tulip bulbs that would produce these extraordinary, colorful variations on the petals of the tulips. And in 1637, there was a run on the market. There was what was called tulip mania. People were investing extraordinary sums for tulip bulbs. In fact, one set of tulip bulbs in 1637 sold for 10 times the average annual income of a craftsman, of a typical craftsman. Can you imagine that? Spending 10 times your annual income on a group of tulip bulbs. And the idea was you could turn around and sell them for even more than that, right? Tulip mania. Well, the market crashed, right? People lost their shirts. And this became an issue for Holland. And this tulip can be seen in certain points in Dutch history as a symbol for wanton misuse of funds, for easy come, easy go, for the idea that it's squandering what you have on something that's is inconsequential. Here's a painting in the Frans Hals Museum by a Flemish painter from down south in what's today Belgium, Jan Bruegel the Younger, which is an allegory of tulip mania, where we see the various tulips around and people collecting them, but of course the people are all monkeys and they're just going crazy over the value of tulips. So with that in mind, I think Balthasar van der Ast's picture, when we look at the tulips, they can be every bit as much a luxurious possession, like gilded cups and beautiful drinking glasses, or we can see them as symbols of ill-gotten gain, a misspent fortune. And one wonders then whether or not those gilded cups mean exactly the same thing. Flower painters everywhere. Jan Davids de Heem came from Utrecht originally, worked there for a while, and then moved back to Antwerp, again in the southern Low Countries. Some of the same themes we saw with Balthasar van der Ast, bugs landing on the flowers, bugs seeming to land on the surface of the picture. And again, here we've got fruit, we've got grapes, so I think that allusion to the myth of Apelles and his contest with Protogenes is well taken. It's been pointed out in many of these still lives that the flowers that are arranged either in vases or on a festoon on your right, that these flowers do not bloom at the same time. And as such, these are an allusion to the painter conquering time, that the painter can bring things together from all seasons through his imaginative creativity in a way that nature itself simply cannot. Rachel Rausch on your left, toward the very end of the period we're discussing, again another of the women artists from this period. The fact that we've seen three is extraordinary in itself in the 17th century. Women were excluded from most artistic affairs, including training, especially working from the live model was difficult for them. But we've seen now three so far: Clara Peters, Rachel Rausch, and Judith Leister. Our last category of still life painting is animal still lifes. Two terrific examples from the Moritz House. A dead animal on your right, a partridge hanging from a nail, and the famous goldfinch by Fabricius, made even more famous by that novel that was so popular a few years back. The question of what, in both of these, again, we see the painters sort of extolling their crafts, showing us the degree of their realism, how much more realistic than reality their works are. Fabricius's goldfinch has such an incredible presence. Goldfinches were kept as pets and could be trained, and they could drink from bowls and whatnot. And I think there's a little silver cup there on the shelf next to him that the goldfinch is meant to be drinking from. But he's tied up with a very light filigree gold chain to the top bar, but can still jump down to the bottom bar to rest and chirp. Nature held captive. Is that a metaphor for what Fabricius is doing as well? Nature held captive. On the right, it's a hunting piece. It's a partridge that's been killed as game bird, hung from a nail as a prize capture, if you will. Also, perhaps bleeding out in order to be aged, eventually to be eaten. We find that a lot of these game still lives with dead animals, were intended for private use in hunting lodges and the like, which gives us some insight, I think, into the ownership of all of these still lives, that the people who own them display them and think of them as reflections of aspects of the world, as part of collecting images of everything, of having an encyclopedic collection of wonders, the wonders of the world. These two larger game pieces in the Rijksmuseum, both came from the royal palace of Soestdijk outside of Utrecht. So the owners of these were the Stadhouwers, parts of the family of Orange, the rulers of the Low Countries. And each of them were intended to reflect the sort of thing that one might see in parts of the palace, which is the day's hunt brought home to age, on its way to becoming dinner. In each of them, we have a juxtaposition of the dead animals themselves with live. The magpie on your right, with its nickname now, the contemplative magpie, or the peacock on your left, and certainly peacocks are themselves extraordinarily symbolic as well. So again, does this tell us anything about the ownership of other works? The fact that we know that some of these were owned by the wealthiest of the wealthy, the most powerful people in all of Holland, were collectors of still life paintings. Hondecoeter's Pelican and Other Birds on the left was another royal country palace, belonged to William and Mary, William of Orange and Mary of England, who had married by that time, who had wed by that time. And this menagerie of birds may well reflect their sort of collection, and it came from the Low Palace, the Het Loo, another of these royal palaces in the country. So again, the fact that we have extraordinarily aristocratic ownership of these pictures makes us wonder whether or not the extraordinary objects that we find in a still life picture, right, the same sort of range of things that we see in this kind of menagerie of birds, whether those too might have appealed more to people of significant means. Here in a portrait by Jan Steen, we see the daughter of the estate owner. The estate that she lives in is seen through the doorway in the back, and their traditional family coat of arms is above the gateway up above. But she's here giving some milk to a little lamb in the poultry yard. She's wandered away from the manor and has come into the foreground here with a dwarf and another man who are keepers of the game. In this case, I think it's part of Jan Steen, even working in portraiture, is giving a sort of a comic wink at the audience about how images like the pelican on your left had this extraordinary appeal to estate owners. And here, this picture would appeal to little Jacopa Maria's father in two different ways. It's his gorgeous little daughter being as cute as can be, feeding a little lamb, having cast aside her hat, with, of course, the family manor in the background. But it would also appeal to him as incorporating this tradition of the animal still life. Two last pictures to finish with are live animals, again, very much like Honda Cooter. Jan Asselein's Threatened Swan, one of the more popular pictures in the Rijksmuseum, this very, very large. It's almost as if it's a portrait of a swan, protecting its nest from violation, from an unseen enemy. The feathers floating in the air as the duck raises its hackles, or the goose, I mean, the swan. This reminds me very much of my mother, when she was a kid, lived on a farm, and she was once attacked by swans. Chased her through the yard, and she's still alive. She remained through the rest of her life, and to this day, extraordinarily afraid of large birds. And this swan shows us the sort of, attack that we think these docile animals can have, and I think that's an important element of its appeal, and I think maybe even of the meaning that Jan Asselein ascribed to the piece, is that the peaceful can in fact rise up. We'll hear more about this from Jessie, because this is her chosen painting to talk about in the Rijksmuseum. She'll be our resident expert. And so we'll hear more about it then. And just as with the still life we saw before, I don't really want to take her words out of her mouth. We'll wrap up with this massive picture of a bull. It's huge. It's 8 feet across the base or so. I mean, the bull is approaching life size. Certainly the man is in it. And Paulus Potter, who specialized in images of animals, particularly farm animals, has brought together his skill and really is showing it off here. This must, I think, have been a bull portrait in a way. And this makes a nice detail for that. A portrait of a very particular bull that would have appealed to the owner of it. That's my guess. I have no proof for this. But it sure does seem, why else would you want an 8-foot picture of a bull with recognizable characteristics? I think that for Potter, like all of our still life artists that we've been looking at, it's an opportunity to demonstrate the extraordinary level of realism, how he can transform paint into other materials. In this case, the fur of the animal, the reflections on its eye, the water beating from its lower lip. It really is an extraordinarily realistic piece. Our second cow looking out at us with the textures are different. The nose, for example, and how the light falls in that. What an extraordinary piece of observation this picture is. But in addition to that, it's an extraordinary piece of alchemy, of transformation. The paint becomes the hair, and he lays down the paint by following the patterns of the fur on the nose of the animal, on the bridge of its nose, between its eyes. And we can see that everywhere, that the paint it's not paint anymore, it is the hair. And he does this throughout the entire picture. He's able to transform some of the paint to look like the longer hair of the cow, but then other parts, the paint is transformed to look like the shorn fleece of the lamb. And as we look closely at it, he's able to transform the paint. You get the sense that if this were in a museum for the blind, that you could rub your fingers over it. You could understand what you were looking at by actually touching it. And again, he signals this realism. He signs it as if he's carved it into the fence behind the ram on the left. And he's highlighted that carving to suggest that these are real surfaces, right? And certainly this realism goes back again to that mythology we talked about of Apelles, the great painter of Greek myth, and Protogenes who could paint uh, things so realistic that flies would land on it. And that level of realism Potter is bringing into the bull as well, where we see not only here but elsewhere flies scattered around. And yes, of course, they would have been there. But, Potter's not a photographer. Potter's a painter, and he includes these different things by choice. And I think in many ways they relate to the miraculous display of ability that we see exhibited before us here. So I can't wait to see this picture again. I was just blown away in the Moritz house when I turned the corner and I saw this massive thing on the wall. And I hope we have some time sort of to sit in front of it and marvel at the painter's craft, which is really, I think, the point for all of these still life pictures.